Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Doty. Welcome to session 3 of the Delaware Economic Summit. I'm here to introduce Jim Butkiewicz and Ed Ratledge, both from the University of Delaware. For the session, last year was good. Will this year be better? Are we on the verge of another bubble? I can't wait to hear about that. If I read both these gentlemen's bios, there would be no time left for them to speak, so just know that they're eminently qualified to be here. So please welcome Jim and Ed.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, but we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to rush right into this. That's a graph. It doesn't look very exciting or very interesting. It shows actual and trend real GDP. It's from 1946 through 2007. The straight red line is the trend line, that's the average, and the blue line is what the economy actually did. You see some things, they don't show up very well. Where did that come from?
That's not I'll get rid of it. Just get rid of it.
Yeah, I'll just get rid of it. There we go. Something doesn't like me. It's certainly not about me. Okay. I'm afraid to touch this now. You see some years here in the 60s, early 70s when growth was pretty high. It's very hard to see recessions there. That's 81, 82, and 90, 91. It's not a very exciting looking graph. Then I want you to look at this. This goes from 1929 through 2013. This is the entire 85 years of GDP history we have. And here you see the Great Depression. Here you see World War II. Here you see the whole boring period in between. And here you see the Great Recession. So some economists might say we really only have 4 observations in the data. A depression, a recession, the World War II boom, and this whole period in between when most of us were living. And you see we actually went through some pretty boring times. The Great Depression was by far the worst, but you see how bad the Great Recession is, okay? Now, these are trend lines, and the data is transformed in a way to give you a smooth trend line. There's another way of looking at this, which is comparing actual GDP, and this is the actual dollar amounts, to what we call potential real GDP. Potential real GDP, where the economy would be operating if it were at its best potential, not a boom, not a recession, but its average growth rate, is calculated by the Congressional Budget Office, and that data begins in 1949. They've never extended it back. And you see here, it shows up a lot better. You see the recessions, the 81, 82 recession, the 90, 91 recession, 2001, and here you see what we call the Great Recession. People ask, and people say, well, you know, we say we're in a recovery, and yet things don't feel so good. Well, a recovery, by the way we define business cycles in the United States, begins whenever you stop going down and start going up. And we're clearly going up. But notice we're also clearly below the trend. And we're pretty substantially below the long-run trend still. Now, the question is, has the trend changed? In fact, if you look closely, I don't know how well you can see this, this is what we would call an exponential function. How many of you remember your calculus? And this should be going up like that. But you notice the trend line here has flattened out. The CBO has reduced the trend rate of growth a little bit as a result of the Great Recession. And we're still below the trend. So for those of us who are working, have maintained our jobs, it feels pretty good. But for a lot of people, it still feels like a recession, even though we have been in recovery since July of 2009. It's still not where we'd like to be, or not where we'd expect it to be. You see most recessions recover more quickly, and the growth rate, for particularly 81, 82, was very rapid, 7, 8% a year for a couple of quarters. Where here, we're just moving along at 2 to 3%, and it's just not very rapid. It's been very slow. So, what's our economy like? Well, output's below trend. Private sector employment has just reached the pre-recession peak. pre-recession peak, but public sector employment is still below peak. You get monthly employment reports. One of the things that people don't pay much attention to, because it's usually buried in the story, if it's in the story at all, is for the past 14 months, the initial employment report has always been lower than the final number. And the employment growth has actually been better than expected. This figure shows the original report. If you get the report, it's going to come out on Friday, because it always comes out on the first Friday of the month, and they'll say 180,000 jobs were created last month, or 80,000, or 210. But then if you read on, it says, and last month's figures were revised up X thousand jobs. Well, the difference between the original and the revised is a difference of, so I got ahead of myself there, 400,000 jobs, or 18% higher than originally reported. So the job growth is actually a little bit better than the reports we're getting each month. And nobody really has made a mention of this, but as I've been following these reports every month, they're always revised up, they're always revised up. So what does the data look like after the revisions? And it actually looks somewhat better, not great, but certainly better than the original reports. Now, every year, it seems like at the end of the year, the economy picks up, things are going good, and then in the spring, things slow down. And we have a stall in the economy. And so the question is this year, because the numbers for January, February, March weren't so great, is this another stall? Or is it going to be a thaw after sort of a record-breaking winter, at least in the eastern two-thirds of the country, where we had much more snow, we had many more days where businesses were closed. Nobody wants to go out and buy a new car when there's snow and salt on the road. You want to wait until the weather clears up. People don't go out and buy houses. So what has happened? Have we had a slowdown, or are things starting to pick up? And actually, the signs are looking a little better. PMI orders, the Purchasing Managers Index, has been improved. Auto sales have started to pick up. We're getting various reports. There's some expectation that business investment might be a little better this year, although housing sales sort of sagged in March, so that was on the negative side. Always when you're looking for these things, there's always some pluses and minuses, and trying to figure out what the overall is sometimes hard to do. Here are the auto and truck sales, and again, you see the Great Recession low, and again, and this is the other thing about economic data, if you're not familiar with dealing with it. If you are, you certainly know this, but if you're not, every month is going to have its ups and downs. So you can't worry about this month when it was down, or when they had the cash for clunkers deal, and you had an unusually high level of sales, and then it went right back down. You see there's a lot of jagged ups and downs here. So what you have to focus on is the trend. And as long as the trend is going up, that's a pretty good sign. The hard part is always predicting when the trend's going to change, or when there's going to be a turning point. And that's not easy to see. That's something economists have been searching for since there's been economics, and we've never ever found the answer to be able to accurately predict when a recession is going to begin, when a recovery is going to come about, things like that. It's always a little bit of a guessing game. Areas of uncertainty. Corporations are very profitable. A big story here today in Delaware is the potential takeover of AstraZeneca. Pfizer has tremendous profits. They're talking about relocating their headquarters to England to avoid taxes, and they've also parked a lot of profits overseas to avoid taxes. Corporations are very profitable. Corporate profits reached 11% of GDP. It's no surprise the stock market's doing well when interest rates are low and profits are high. If you have to ask why, I think there's a good part of the explanation. Areas of uncertainty. We don't know if corporations are going to spend. A second area is, will incomes grow when consumers spend? There's a very close relationship between consumers' income after taxes, what we call personal disposable income, that's adjusted for inflation, and consumer expenditure. So if consumers earn more money, they're going to spend more. The question is, are they going to be earning more? Inflation-adjusted hourly earnings are going up slowly. They're not going up very rapidly. This number looks pretty low, but that's because we're dividing by the consumer price index from 1982 84, which is going to lower the numbers a lot. The other thing that's going on in the economy, and it's been a trend globally, is the disparity in earnings. People who are educated, professionals, are earning high incomes and doing well. If you don't have a lot of skills, the more technological world in which we live in has not been very kind. If you're an unskilled worker or poorly skilled worker, you're just not doing well in today's economy. That's not a US phenomenon, that's a global phenomenon. That's happening in countries all around the world. In fact, the World Bank has a measure that they call labor share of total output or total income. What percent of total output is going to labor? And that number, in a number of the developing countries around the world, has been shrinking. And again, returns have been higher to capital, and the people who own capital are generally better off. They're professionals. Wage workers, hourly workers just have not done as well. And that's our labor share has gone in the United States from about 70%, which for many years we said was always going to be constant when we taught our economics classes. Now it's down to about 65%. So that's been a pretty dramatic reduction. Those who are fortunate enough to own securities are reaping the benefits. Those who have high-paying professional jobs are reaping the benefits. But there is this disparity. Another issue is the aging of society, but evidence indicates that professionals, even as they get older, don't necessarily retire. I won't say anything about Ed and myself, but neither one of us is close to retiring, and we're at ages where years ago we might have been retired.
Dead.
No, yeah, that too. Medicine works wonders, doesn't it? But people who don't have the benefit of much education are retiring, relatively young ages, in their early 60s, but professionals who can earn high incomes now are working far longer, often well into their 70s. And that just widens the income disparity because those who retire may not have much of a pension, may be living on Social Security, or those of us who continue to work are pretty well off, no question about that. The IMF has reduced its global growth forecast a 0.1%. That may not seem like much, but there are signs around the world that economies are slowing down. Europe is having its trouble. China is definitely slowing down, and that's affecting our economy and our exports. And again, the exports numbers, what happened there? There was supposed to be a slide that disappeared. Oh well.
Assume the slide.
That was what it was showing was our trade balance, and it was always negative, and it was going down. I don't know what happened to that one. It disappeared. Okay. The Federal Reserve, because people are always wondering what the Fed is going to do, and the Fed did start to change last year as Chairman Bernanke was headed out. What they did is they cut back on their bond buying, their $85 billion a month that they were buying of Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities. And every meeting, and they're meeting right now, today, 1 or 2 days, I don't remember, today and tomorrow, they're meeting again, and they'll probably scale back their bond buying another $10 billion. In spite of that, Chairman Yellen, which it's interesting, the number of ladies in the room, you know that Janet Yellen is the first female chair of the Federal Reserve Board since the Federal Reserve came into operation in 1914. So after 100 years, they finally get a female who's the head of the Federal Reserve Board. She has indicated that she's going to continue much the same policies with regard to interest rates, keeping interest rates very low. On this figure, which actually did appear, this is the Federal Reserve's, the T-bill rate is actually a rate that's very closely tied to the Federal Reserve's target federal funds rate. And you see it's like 0.1%. It's been like 0.1% since the end of 2008 when in December when they raised their target interest rate to near zero, or between 0 and 0.25%. Long-term rates are harder for the Fed to influence. The purpose of the bond buying program was to try and drive these long-term rates down. Now, why does that matter? Well, the short-term interest rates, and the federal funds rate is a 24-hour rate for those of you who don't deal in financial matters. It's basically loans that banks make to one another for a 24-hour period, from 12:01 today till 12 tomorrow. The rates that matter for our economic behavior are the rates on car loan. The car loan may be 5 years. That's an intermediate interest rate. The mortgage rate on your house. That may be 15, 20, or 30-year mortgage, depending on what type of mortgage you select. Corporations, when they invest to build new facilities and so forth, they may issue bonds. They may issue bonds that are 10 years. So what matters for economic activity are 5, 10, 15, 20-year rates. A measure that we often look at is the 10-year Treasury bond rate. And you see that did come down at the short rates, but never as much. And this right here, I can tell you when that was. That was May 22nd of last year. That was the day that Bernanke hinted that they may start cutting back on their bond buying. And ever since then, the 10-year rate went up from about 1.8, where it was, to almost 3, and it's bouncing around 2.8 right now. Every day it goes up or down a little bit. But that's like 50% increase. That's a fairly substantial increase. And the economy so far and the financial markets so far have weathered that increase. We haven't seen a great crash in the stock market. It was up 80 points when I left my office this morning. The Dow was up, but who knows by now, because it's been another hour. So it could be down 80 by now, the way the market's been. The volatility has certainly increased. But, oh, here we go again. I haven't even touched anything.
No, it's not you, it's the laptop.
Okay. So, all right. This is, okay. We'll go back. Talk a little bit about Delaware. And Ed's going to talk a lot more about Delaware. The Delaware economy has gone through a dramatic shift. If you go back and look at data as to when Delaware was in the 1960s, we were very heavily a manufacturing economy. About 40-some% of our state's output, as measured by some statistics created by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Department of Commerce, 40% or more was classified as manufacturing. We had chemicals, and we had automobiles, and we had a lot of other heavy industry. But that was on a steady decline. And one of the things, again, this is something you're probably all aware of, what's happened to manufacturing in the last half century or so is the same thing that's happened to agriculture over the last 200 years. Technology has greatly reduced the need for workers. That's good and it's bad. One of the great things about heavy industry was that it created opportunities for people who didn't necessarily need a lot of formal education. You could be a high school graduate, go to work in a steel mill, a tire factory, an auto assembly plant, and earn a good income and have a good life. And a lot of people think somehow that's going to return. Well, guess what? It's never coming back. If you go into a factory today, the employee you're more likely to see is somebody with an engineering degree who knows how to run and maintain the equipment and work the computers that are doing everything that goes on in the factory. This is what's happened in agriculture over the course of 100 years, 200 years. The Department of Agriculture estimated that in 1790, 9 out of 10 workers in the United States were directly producing food or in farming of some sort. It may be cattle and so forth. Today, our food for a much larger population is produced by less than 1% of the labor force. And farmers still work hard, but now they have $600,000 to $800,000 pieces of equipment, where in 1790 they had a wooden plow and some sort of beast of burden, a mule or a horse or an ox or something to pull it. Today they're far more productive. The same thing has happened in manufacturing. What we're worried about is when it starts happening in services and all the rest of us are affected. And you can see it coming in education as they start to use more and more video technology and so forth and get rid of these high-paid, overpriced professors and knock us out of the job. I mean, that day will likely come too. Maybe not right away, but that may be on the way. What happened in Delaware is this huge shift from manufacturing, and the other thing that happened is the Bureau of Economic Analysis and a lot of countries changed to a different way of measuring economic activity. So there's new data that starts in '97. This really should go back to the '80s for comparison. In 1981, we passed the Financial Center Development Act, which dramatically changed Delaware's economy. We went from being a manufacturing economy, and that employment had been in the decline anyway, to being a financial economy. And you see the dramatic increase in finance and insurance in Delaware's GDP, as measured by the Department of Commerce, over 35%. And the US average is about 8%. So we're disproportionately reliant on finance. Now, the good thing is, although you see the downturn here with the financial crisis, we sort of held our own. And in fact, the recent data from the State Department of Labor indicate that some of the job growth has been in the financial area. So, but you wonder how long we can sustain this as a state. How long can the state have 35% or more of its economic activity in one sector? Particularly a sector that's come under a lot of criticism, a sector that's subject to increased regulation and scrutiny. You just wonder what's going to happen there. So, Delaware's unemployment rate is improving. We're down to 5.9, I think, the most recent report. It was 6 and now 5.9. We've shifted from manufacturing to finance. Is this really sustainable? Where's our growth coming from? That's one of the things that economists would worry about. The governor made some bets on alternative energy. The Bloom facility in Newark is working. They don't have the employees that they promised. But other bets, like Fisker, have not fared so well. One of the problems that alternative energy sources are facing has been what's happened in other states with fracking and other energy discoveries, that the price of energy has just not gone up the way people expected. And so these alternative technologies, which someday will probably be very profitable and useful, but they aren't there yet. It takes a long, long time sometimes to develop new products which are economically competitive. And right now, the low price of energy from natural gas, from fracking just north of us in Pennsylvania, also in Ohio, the oil that's being discovered out in the Dakotas, particularly North Dakota, the world's still very heavily reliant on coal. As much as coal pollutes things, that we're still using a lot of coal. And there are other deposits we know of in states where they have not allowed any fracking technology to be applied. New York has some. California, from what I've read, has huge amounts of energy that could be obtained through fracking technology, but California has not yet permitted it. So there's a lot of fossil fuels still out there to be reclaimed by one technology or the other, and that works against things like electric cars because gas prices are higher. When I started driving, which was a long, long time ago, gasoline prices were probably about 30 cents a gallon. If you adjust that for inflation, it's well over $2 a gallon today, probably $2.20 or something like that. So I know gas prices have just gone up here in Delaware, but they were as low as just $3.20 not too long ago. So although they're higher, adjusted for inflation, it's really not that high. And again, compared to other countries where the taxes on fossil fuels, on gasoline are so high, our gas prices are very, very cheap. And we see this always in the size of cars we love to drive, because we like bigger vehicles. Out in the parking lot, there's a whole bunch of SUVs and things like that, and that's what Americans like to drive, and they're not the greatest on gas, but the prices aren't that high. That's what we drive. So there are some questions ahead. I know you want to know where we're going. There are some signs that the economy is picking up. Is it going to be great? No, I don't think so. Could we get to 3% growth later in this year? I think that's very likely, particularly if businesses do start to spend and invest. The Delaware picture, I'm going to leave more to my colleague Ed, because he's the true expert on Delaware. But there are some uncertainties, and I'll let Ed address them. And what we agreed on is I was going to talk, and Ed's going to speak, and then we'll have questions at the end. So thank you. And Ed, it's all yours.
Behind all the numbers that Jim was talking about. People are the problem. It's what people do is the issue. Are they going to consume? Are there going to be more of them? Are there going to be less of them? What are their preferences at various points in time? And so we spent a lot of time looking at what people are doing, in particular in the state of Delaware. Now, one of the things here, there's a couple things to point to. These are curves from 1790 to 2040 on the amount of population we have in Delaware. And you can see, it's showing up here anywhere. Oh, it's up there. Okay, you can see that we're starting to turn over, we're increasing at a decreasing rate. But if you compare that down here with Newcastle County, for example, what's Newcastle County doing? It's been going very, very slowly here over the last 10 years. You can see Sussex County was running very close with Kent County for a number of years. Then it basically exploded, but then Kent started to show some spunk here in the last couple of years. Now, one of the things that I watch is basically how these places basically grow. And this will be true for a series of charts that I'm going to show you in the next few minutes. You can see that basically that there's a red line there. The red line is what we call natural increase. Births minus deaths. Very important kind of thing. And what do you see? It's generally fairly stable in Kent County. It's about 1,000 people. So you would say that that's what it was probably going to grow, that's the rate it was going to grow, unless something else happens. And that other factor is migration, net migration. Once we opened up, for example, Route 1 down to Smyrna, and then people figured out, wait a second, I can drive to Cherry Hill, they're charging me $10,000 a year in property taxes, and I can buy 3 times the house of what I have to do in New Jersey. So we had a lot of people that migrated down to southern Delaware to northern Kent County. And you can see those numbers, in fact, post-2000, would you say they had a bubble? That's what happened basically to the population. We had a major migration into Kent County at that point in time. We went from this 1,000 number down here, natural increase, all the way up to several thousand, more than that, a year. And then what happened in 2008? The bottom dropped out. What happened to migration? The migration stopped. So as a result of that, we got about 24,000 properties down there that never got built that people were thinking they were going to get built. And of course, a lot of contractors went bust. So that's been the general pattern here. The other things I'd point out here that we are aging here, so you're starting to see these natural increase lines start to decrease a bit more. We don't have really a continuous upturn back on the migration side in Kent County, so they're basically kind of fixed at around 1,500 people a year at this point. Different problem here in Newcastle County. And you can see, just in general, the total growth a year has been declining for some period of time. And you've got, of course, in the early stages, we have out migration at the lower end of the period, more people leaving the county than we're entering. And then we've gradually built that up in the 80s and to a peak up here. And now what's been happening? It's basically been falling, fewer and fewer people coming in over the last 20 years or so. So what we're seeing there is basically the fact that we haven't been able to generate jobs. In Newcastle County, it's job generation that causes migration in. That's the principal issue there. So that's one of the things that we have to kind of watch out for. In the last couple of years, we're starting to see a little bit of spike in that particular number. So it's turned around. So it's actually positive. We were actually negative in 2009 again. What do you see in Sussex County? Where's the red line? Yeah, it's slightly negative now. And so you got more people dying than are born down there, and it's largely the age distribution down there. Totally different kind of pattern than you see in the other counties. By the way, Kent County is the youngest county anyway. And it's all dependent upon basically on migration, as you can see. And they had a bit of a bubble, more than a bit of a bubble here during that leading up to 2007, and then obviously straight down as we move back down to a little bit more consistent level for migration at that point. So you got totally different patterns among the 3 counties as to what's happening there in terms of growth. If you look at it for the state, you can see the same kind of patterns happen here. We've got a bit of it's somewhat stable around 4,500, but now we start to see that the effect of the older population starting to feed in relative to our fertility rates. And we can see also that the migration that we did experience during the boom times or the bubble times has kind of stabilized and come back. If you then turn that around and say, well, what do these people do? In most cases, they have to have a house to live in, don't they? So one of the places going to show up is going to find more housing construction. So this is, and you can see, let me just go through this real quickly. You can see where we know how to do this now.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out where did I hit it?
Nothing.
No, okay, it's just
You didn't do anything. You're good.
I had a session of kind of like this I was doing to a class this semester, and all of a sudden Hewlett-Packard decided that they wanted to investigate everything on my machine. So it was totally out of control. Of course, everybody enjoyed the fact that I was a mess. Students can be relatively easily amused. So anyway, so here's Delaware building permits, and you can see what was happening here for a number of years. We were kind of floating around that 4,000 period. And then you got just post 2000, what happened? The bubble started. And the bubble kind of went up to 2005, 2006 in that period of time. And then what happened? The bottom fell out. Same things that those migration numbers and everything that they were seeing. And that was actually, if you were any financial people here, if you watch building permits, you would have basically seen in 2007, early 2007, something is going wrong here. And of course, there was our one friend, I've forgotten his name, that made $1.8 billion off the bet. You just run down there, get your shorts on the mortgages involved, and make a bundle. Well, that's what you watch these numbers for. Hopefully, you can forecast it, and it didn't go up the other direction. In any event, so we continue on down here, and you can see what we've been doing here the last couple of years. We've been kind of flat. We're well below the normal rate of increase on housing units. And then the last 2 years, we finally started to come back to something that looks like it might be the trend level for the state. So we're just coming back into that area, even though it's been, when we say the second quarter of 2009 was the end of the recession. So we're a little ways out from that. You can see the same thing happen in Kent County. I won't belabor this, and it's come back at this point and actually it's very close to what its trend line is if you use this point back here. So these it was clearly a bubble in the sense that we were out of our normal track for these things. Going then to Newcastle County, well, it's not the same thing. That's the extent of their bubble. But the interesting thing is that has basically started to turn around now, and it's back up to at least close to 1,000 units. And let's see, I'm sorry, that was the Sussex County. All right, well, that's actually slightly above trend. One of the things that happened on this, if you look back here to 2008, the bottom dropped out in Sussex County real fast. Second homes, that was the first thing that people cut back on. So all of that was hit over in 2008. It's now taken them nearly 5 years to get back to that position, and then we're starting to see at least some light, but it'll still take a while. Prices are still a lot of people holding mortgages out there. They're underwater as well, which doesn't help us all either. The other thing that I think is important on people's behavior on this, if you look at the U.S. savings rate, another one of these much, you can see basically what happened during the bubble and the bottom. Then people basically said, "Oh, I'm not spending anything. We'll pay down my debt if I do that." And actually, I think 70% of the people in a recent survey said they were using their tax return this year to reduce their credit, their credit card debt. So people are still in that mode of not consuming as much as they possibly were doing before, and they're still trying to get their balance sheet straightened out. This is just a picture of what happened. This is not Delaware, but this is nationally at At the top, you can see back here in 2000, where we started an index of 100 in prices. You can see how much they increased from 2000 to the fourth quarter of 2006. In Los Angeles, they went from 100 to 270 in terms of price. The same thing happened in Arizona, it happened down in Miami, and all these other places. And then we had the crash. Now, what's happened since then, we've had a little bit price action. Oh, let me just point out that Atlanta, Dallas, Cleveland, places like that never had a bubble to amount to anything. So it was highly variable around there. And we're down, the prices are starting to climb a bit now, which may make people feel a little bit better about their own home. Maybe they're less underwater than they used to be. And we can do that. Now, one of the things that gives me pause on this is a long, and this is that comes out of the Case-Shiller work as well. If we go back to the 1890s and we come up here and say this is 100, that whatever the price was of your house, that's what is 100. And you watch how that, in real terms, how that changed. And of course, this is the Depression here. And you can see we had too many bubbles here. This is how far out of line that particular, the housing bubble was at that point. We had nothing on the charts that would even show it. It's pretty major. And then we came back down in price. It looked like we might be headed to something down in the 110 range or something like that, which would be the reason then we started back up again. I'm not convinced at this point that we're through this thing. And that's because there's some things which are just slightly out of kilter. The other one that's kind of always fun to look at, and I got a couple more things to say about that in a minute. On the consumer confidence. Now you can see, actually this looks like one of your charts. For that, the bottom fell. Well, that same thing happened. Consumer confidence. You'll notice you don't see a number like that anywhere else on the chart. And then when you come up, and we've kind of been staggering around the 80 number for some time, but nothing is taking off and going up like we've seen some of these other moves. If people don't have confidence, they don't buy houses, they don't buy cars, they don't do a lot of things. They want to have more cash in their pocket or in the bank, and they improve their financial condition. And that's basically what seems to be what's happening now. Now that will change, I'm sure, over time. The other piece on this that concerns me a bit, this is Delaware mortgages past due. If you can look up here, before we started this climb, this is 2006 fourth quarter. And this is the number of mortgages past due. And it climbed up here to almost 9% of all the mortgages in Delaware were past due. Now we see we've come back a little bit, then there's this period here where it would drop down almost to 7%, and then it bumped back up, and then so it's wiggling around up in this way. But whatever it is, it ain't down here, which is where it probably should be. So it means that there are still a lot of problems out there at this point that have to be dealt with. The other one is the foreclosure issue. You can see we're coming back here in 2007. We were running about 1% of the mortgages were in foreclosure. It went up to over 4. Fairly remarkable move. And where's it back down to now? It's down to 3.5. Well, I look at that and I'm thinking, I got to draw a line out here somewhere. Unless there's some percent, the other side's going to look like this, and I got to draw a line out here. I'm thinking 2017, 2018. How's that for a forecast? Right there, right. So when you see things, these have to be resolved at some point. You can't have units in foreclosure forever. So they have to be resolved. The question is, when are they going to be resolved? This is a good one, though. This is by the way, this is the Biden curve. Do you know about the Biden curve? This is when he was senator, he had the Senate banking thing. They put the law in that you couldn't, consumers could not get rid of all their debts and go into Chapter 11. Bankruptcy, they just took that away. So everybody was getting into the acts up here to the law. Then basically you take down to the bottom here, which and then we started climbing back up. But it appears that people's condition are a little bit better. So I see that as a reasonably positive thing. And bankruptcy courts have confirmed that it's true across the country. We're starting to see get a little bit better at that point. Here's the other concerning thing, and I think Jim mentioned this as well. If you look at this is the mortgage, basically the mortgage rates, and all of a sudden they start turning around. And one of the things that you'll, when that happens, and people say, well, prices usually are going to make a change at that point because you're willing to pay less for something because your interest rates are going to be higher because you're really looking at what the payment is. That's what people make their determination. So this is starting to get to be an issue, and this is this will be the beginning of the yellow curve. So it's an issue. I think Jim already went through this. This is just a quick look at how different incomes look in Delaware. If you take Newcastle County at the top, this is the Delaware average on per capita personal income, and then we got Sussex at the bottom, Kenton at the bottom, and Sussex in the middle of the pack, but substantially different from Newcastle. Very different kinds of situations. This is not the people that live in the big houses down there. This is the people who work in the chicken plants and the other things in the food industry down there primarily. This is an area that, and Jim already covered part of this. The yellow line here over here from 2000 has been kind of increasing fairly dramatically, and then starting to turn over a little bit. That's healthcare, jobs in healthcare, that whole industry. That's alive, and as long as we have all the old timers around, it's probably going to be there. Going to take some of their bucks out of the bank and pay for their aluminum knees or whatever they put in their knees. Do you have aluminum knees or anybody got even? Is it titanium?
I think it is titanium.
So that's kind of a good thing. It's kind of an unknown with the Affordable Care Act, precisely how all that's going to play out, what that's going to do for prices as well, and that's an open question. That will affect some of the employment in that sector as well. You can see the manufacturing side on the employment basically dropping, not just over this the boom or the Great Recession period, but just on a secular decline. And then you can see down here, what you'll see is the construction industry. And that's the one that's basically been taking the big hit, because the housing industry. We don't have enough residential construction in order to keep that going. How many do one time? Okay. This is the other thing is when you see people talking about manufacturing, they always were really talking about manufacturing employment, concerned about manufacturing employment. Here's what outputs looks like. Manufacturing output is doing fine. That's because they got these machines that milk the cows and all these other types of things that they find it's efficient to do, and those type of devices will continue to be built. I think this is the same graph that Jim showed you. This is Delaware employment in manufacturing in the U.S., and they're both going the same direction, down. Here's the one that's really driving, though, the next 30 years or so forth. Our friends up here, the 65 and plus crowd, we'll see we're going back here somewhere. This is basically the portion of 65 plus. And what we're looking at through 2040, actually 2030, we will basically double the number of people in that age group. Double. So whatever you can think about the old folks, they're going to need a lot of stuff. And fortunately, we got all you young folks who are going to pay for it. We have our Social Security, thank you. We have our Medicare, thank you. And so forth. So and there are other things you're going to have to pay for that you don't even know about now, and I don't even know. But that's the problem. Basically, we got a huge chunk of people up in this top group. And when I look at the 0 to 19 group, and I look at the group just before that, the 45 to 64 group, that by the time I get to there, I got 267,000 in 45 to 64. I only got 248 in the 0 to 19, which is the group that they're supposed to be replacing them. So there's not enough people. So either we have to migrate them in, or we got to produce them. Maybe a new industry. Just a thought. The other thing that is happening to us up here, labor force participation, the number of people that are actually in the labor force. Now you've heard some talk about that. You have people that have dropped out of the labor force and are not probably never going to return for all practical purposes. But it's come down fairly significantly in this point. We're down basically from 68% down to about 62% in the state. Means there's less people there to produce output, produce income, and so forth. And that's going to have to be. It's kind of like having a virus or something. Okay. Good. You can see two things here. What the bad thing about that is that these 50 to 64 group, you can see that for the most part they're 67% or so are in the labor force, and then all of a sudden at 65 plus, what happens? It goes to 10%. So now, we need some of these people to work. It's what we need, but they want their pensions, their Social Security, and whatever, and they don't want to work. So what that does is just continues to push the load down lower. Now there's a couple problems with that. What does it look like has happened in that 19 to 34 year rate? Looks like it's got a downside on it, doesn't it? Well, but this is the problem that you've got where young people coming out of school can't find any place to work. And that's a kind of a major issue. Now what this leads to then is you have in this state, at least from 2007 to 2011, we've had literally no increase in the number of households in the state, which goes down back to this whole construction kind of thing and so forth. It's been relatively flat. Just started to turn up a little bit. And that's because a lot of kids are staying home. They're finishing their school. They're staying home. They need to either save money and so forth. They can't get a job that makes enough money to make it even worthwhile, so they have to pay mom and pop rent. Mom and pop probably don't want you in there either. But that's a whole very problematic kind of situation that we're facing right now. How that gets washed out is hard to say. I just got a couple of slides back here to show you what the state is going to be facing here. This is the blue line here is basically our revenue base. The red line is our expenditures. You can see how choppy it was during the Great Recession. And we can see right now our forecasted revenues are well below, about 120 million below what our expenditures are forecasted at right now. You might have read something about this in the papers recently. Well, that hasn't been resolved as yet for a whole series of problems. So we've got a couple of different problems we're having because we've got more people are getting their personal income from transfer payments. That's things like Social Security. So guess what? Social Security is not taxable in Delaware to anybody. Big issue. We also have here a huge pension exclusion, up to $25,000 for a couple over age 60. Now I'm working to get all this changed. Try to help you folks out. But what it does is basically means we have less and less of the income that's being produced. First of all, you got people not producing because they're retiring, and then second of all, they're getting from non-taxable sources. So we can't, we basically are having trouble with getting revenues to go up. So that's a problem. We have this thing, another thing that we're looking at. You may have heard about Medicaid. Medicaid is the health care for the poor folks. Well, we've got 250,000 almost that are on Medicaid in the state of Delaware. That's almost a quarter of the population. It's a very wide program. It also is costing us over $700 million a year right now. And that's headed up. The other issue that we're still, it's not a problem at this stage, but we're at the pension liabilities. You must have read about that in the paper. You've read about Detroit, certainly in these other things. These are issues that are going to face all of the public sector in the long term. And the final one I'm going to put up here is our child poverty rates. which are abysmal at this point, and it's the problem that's facing the schools, of the assets that the individual kids have for helping them go through school and so forth. I don't see this problem getting any better right now, and it's going to, independent of what you spend on education or other kinds of programs, it's going to be a very, very difficult play going on. So these are all things that you can look for to be very positive about, and so because you're going to have an interesting life. Thanks. We can take questions if you have any questions. Yeah.
I'm interested in having you comment on, do you think there's been enough changes in the environment to lessen the chance of another 2008? In other words, things like the Dodd-Frank bill and things that aren't happening that are supposed to be helping. Have there been any changes or enough, or are we just likely to make the exact same mistakes again?
You can answer that?
Yeah, why don't you answer that? I have an opinion on it, but
See, when our country was young, Alexander Hamilton created the first bank of the United States, which was to act as a central bank, and almost immediately it got into trouble and had to be rescued. Our history ever since has been financial crises, and every time that we have one, we make some changes to prevent the last one from happening. But that doesn't mean we've ever found a way to prevent the next one from happening. So, for example, the Federal Reserve was created, the legislation was passed on December 23rd of 1913. When you become a professor, you learn a lot of trivia. It may be good only on Jeopardy. In any case, the Federal Reserve Act was passed as a result of the Panic of 1907. If you remember the Panic of 1907, that was the famous one where we were rescued not by the government, but by a banker. J.P. Morgan took all the bankers in New York, brought them to his house, locked the front door, put the key in his pocket, and said, when you guys figure out a solution, you can go home. I'll unlock the door. No, I don't think the Dodd-Frank has solved the problem. In fact, a lot of critics say that what's happened is we have more big banks, and these banks are all still too big to fail. And if they get in trouble again, they're going to have to be rescued again. So the simple answer is no. Do you want to comment?
no, I mean I think that's the case. And the other thing, if you go back and look at it, what were the banks based? Everybody would like to blame it on the banks, but where did the money go? And went to developers, and went to the people who sold their homes before the peak. Well, the money was not in the banks, but where they got themselves into trouble is basically how they handled that debt in the first place. The collateralization of the debt that they did have, and the fact that they could pass mortgages off to the federal government. Now, of course, the federal government was doing some of that beforehand, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of blame to go around. But I agree with Jim. There's no way, we have no idea of how to stop it. Dodd-Frank is not.
And remember that this crisis, well, the history of crises, and actually there's a very famous book that was published in 1910 called The History of Crises in the American Banking System. And that means the whole 19th century was fallen. And the Great Depression was all about banking crises. And we had Continental Illinois, which was the first too big to fail in 1984. We had the S&L crisis in the late 80s and early 90s. So, it just goes on and on and on. And this crisis wasn't even really most of the banks. This was the shadow banking system. These were the investment banks in particular that had really taken these positions in these mortgages, and also the government agencies, Freddie and Fannie, which had been actually instructed to create a market in mortgages that they heretofore had never purchased. Bill Clinton signed the act or the executive order in 1999, and George Bush continued it. I want to be a critic of both parties. I don't want to have miss the chance to criticize any president. So we're trying to be equal opportunity here. But Clinton started it, but Bush continued it. So it wasn't one party or anything like that, and they were all cheerleading. For decades, the home ownership per household in the United States was around 64, 65%, and it went up to almost 70. the peak of the bubble.
And Delaware went to 73.
And then now it's back down,
It's down 68.
down to where it was before. So, you know, there was a lot of this home ownership is good, but, you know, frankly, a lot of these people who were encouraged to buy homes really shouldn't have purchased homes. They just weren't in the position. A lot of low-income households, housing has what I call housing shocks. When your hot water heater goes, you call the plumber, and they say, oh, that'll be $800 or $1,200 or something. People who are making $25,000 a year can't afford shocks like that. But if they rent, in that rent that you pay every month is any person who rents, who's actually going to stay in business, knows enough to put money aside to replace and rebuild the capital, just as homeowners do. But low-income homeowners weren't used to that. And the other problem is, talking about all the blame, the people who were making the loans were mortgage bankers who aren't bankers at all. They are lenders, and they initiate loans. They hold them for, I think, 90 days, and then they sell them to Fannie and Freddie or to the investment banks. They make all their money on the initiation fees, and they let people on because the type of loans they were making were called 228s. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not. You would get a teaser rate, a very low interest rate for 2 years, and then it would jump up for the next 28 years on your 30-year mortgage, and they would tell these people, okay, so you come in to borrow, okay, first-time borrow. I'm going to give you this rate for 2 years, then it's going to go up. But, you know, you can refinance because housing prices always go up. Okay? And if there's more settlement costs, you can put those into the mortgage and get another low rate for another 2 years. And you can keep doing this and keep doing this. And that's what people are encouraged to do. But, and the Federal Reserve in 2003 and 2004 had a 1% interest rate. At that time, an all-time historic low, because they were very worried about the lack of job creation. Then they started to raise it, and in 17 consecutive steps, they raised it from 1 to 5.25. That had two consequences, as you've seen in both the graphs we've shown. That started to push mortgage rates up. So these people who had these 228s, when it started to jump up after 2 years, all of a sudden it took a bigger jump than expected, which means the monthly payments went up higher than expected. And the second thing was, house prices stopped going up. So you could no longer refinance. And so now you were stuck with a mortgage you couldn't afford. You were led to believe you're going to own a home for the first time ever. And now you couldn't afford the payments. And this wasn't necessarily the banks doing it, although the banks historically have gotten more into mortgages because they lost a lot of their commercial loan business because the securities market took it away, because people could finance, businesses could finance their activity by issuing commercial paper and short-term debt. So banks had to get more into mortgages, but it wasn't the banks who made a mortgage loan to hold that were causing the trouble. It was mortgage bankers who were making mortgage loans to sell to somebody else that were the real source of the problem. And the people they sold to were government agencies which were instructed to buy it. The private sector on their own may not have gotten into this business had not Fannie and Freddie started down that road. And then, of course, on the other side, you came in and told me you were making $57,000 a year when you were really making $17,000. And they started to make loans like that where they didn't check people's incomes. The normal underwriting standards went out the window. So, as Ed already said, there's lots of blame to go around. There were a lot of liars on both sides of the table.
The other thing I know is I never ask Jim a question about banking because I know I'm going to have to listen for an hour and a half, or 2 or 3 or 4, because he knows a lot about this stuff.
The interesting thing, I attended a talk by President Clinton at Temple University on this about a month ago, and he would argue that the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, or whatever, really, I don't know what it was really called, but did not prove to have anything to do with the crisis at all. Because what he would say is the institutions that failed were not, they were either specifically investment banks or specifically the other kind of whatever.
Yeah. Glass-Steagall Act passed in 1933. By the way,
30 seconds.
No, can't do that. We've gone next. Had 3 provisions. One was that it controlled interest rates on your deposits, which, if you're old enough to remember, was phased out in the 80s. The second, it separated commercial investment banking, which I'll come to. The third is it created the FDIC, which was never eliminated. That's still with us, last I checked, right? So they were the three main provisions. The separation of commercial investment banking was the banks had branches that dealt with stocks and bonds. That's investment banking. They were separated. So Morgan Bank became J.P. Morgan, and Morgan Stanley was the investment bank. And that's the way the industry went. The problems were with the investment banks this last time, the shadow banks, much more. And so I've always asked, perhaps rhetorical questions, I know my answer. If Glass-Steagall had never been passed, would the investment banks have been more regulated? Because the investment banks, once they were freed up, were regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which didn't really pay much attention to them, while the commercial banks were regulated by the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, or state banking commissions, or some combination of those. So I agree. And by the way, the Glass-Steagall Act was effectively eliminated in 1988 when the Federal Reserve allowed banks to have a securities affiliate as long as there were firewalls, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1989. So it wasn't even 1999, it was in the 80s that banks started getting back into
Yeah,
the
he didn't
securities
actually
business.
say Glass-Steagall. What he was saying was what I didn't know what it was called.
Yeah.
Everybody's been referring
Well,
to.
the separation of commercial investment banking, and that's what everybody says. Everybody calls it Glass-Steagall, and that's what the act was actually the Banking Act of 1933, but the two sponsors were Carter Glass and Henry Steagall. So,
Did you know Henry?
yeah, knew him well. And Carter as well. Carter was a newspaper reporter from Lynchburg, Virginia, who became senator, secretary of Treasury, House of Representatives. He had a big career. His papers were at the University of Virginia. I've actually read them. Something. Another question.
Yeah, we have time for about one more quick question.
Yes.
Lots of good information, but one of the Delaware slides talking about expenditures, government expenditures, obviously there's a massive difference, but relative to inflation, is that significantly higher? And what is that attributable to? Is it from the feds to the states? Is it, yeah, it's pretty strong. I don't know how it was like that, right? So maybe inflation's like that.
Well, largely it's governed by the kinds of programs that the legislature passes, and then there's some things that kind of go up automatically. I mean, over a third of our budgets in the schools, and that's that's $1.4 billion, and then that's throwing another $1.2 billion on top of that. So the schools cost more money each year, and then you've got the various programs that they run, so those kind of continue up at a certain rate. But it's certainly higher than what inflation would be, for the most part, except in earlier parts in maybe the 80s.
Per capita, you focus on Delaware relative to other states, it's per capita.
Well, it's hard to tell when you talk about Delaware, because so many of our expenditures are at the state level. Most people have their school systems are done at the county level, for example, so they don't get this. You have to be very clear how you put those together.
Yes, the other thing about Delaware is Delaware has been, for a small state, a big state couldn't do this nearly as well, it's been very good at exporting a lot of its taxes.
Yeah.
We collect a lot of revenue from non-residents, and that keeps our taxes low. I mean, property taxes.
56% of our stuff is paid by somebody else.
Yeah, the property taxes in Delaware are extraordinarily low compared to
49.
almost any other state. But one of the concerns is, will our ability to export taxes in the future be as great as it was in the past? And that's an issue that the state faces as well.
We spent a lot of time finishing up talking about mortgages, and ironically enough, our next session is all about mortgages. So if you'd like to stick around in a half hour, we start our next one. But in the meantime, please say thank you very much to Ed and Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you.